Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I will have a conversation with my great friend Trent. Hello, Trent.
Hi, everybody. This is Chen. I'm also based in Austin, Texas. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe, late medieval China. Great to be with you all today.
So, what we have been discussing in the past few episodes has been centered on the concept of human nature and how human nature can be defended or reshaped or rejected based on post-Darwinian evolutionary biology. And we have focused on Grant Ramsey's book, Human Nature. We've talked about all sorts of approaches that exist to human nature, how we might be able to come up with an idea of human nature that is not so much about human essence and what alternatives are on our plate. And we talked also extensively last time about Ramsey's alternative, which he calls life histories, a cluster account, which basically kind of combines different elements of the cluster approaches, and it's contrasted with the trade bin approach. And the gist of it is that for Ramsey, it's not about random traits; it's about relations between traits, which creates clusters of them. So basically, the causally sustained probability distributions of traits as exist within nature and what makes those clusters non-random, right? For Ramsey, it's not that we all are having like a list of traits and they're all equal. Uh, they are not equal at all because they have these kind of, causal structure about them. For Ramsey, this understanding of the causal relations is existing within humanity, which he calls human nature, these patterns of clusters, is a here and now kind of an issue, meaning that this is not about humanity as a whole, it's about humanity as we know it now. This story would have been very different when we were beginning to differentiate from like apes. Like that could be a very different story. Now, for Ramsey, there are, that implies from like it's implied from his system that like, sequence of traits matter, developmental pathways matter. And all of these are kind of like different ways to talk about this whole idea of cluster and how data is what we need to look for when we're looking at humanity and its nature. What we're going to do today is to discuss our criticism of Ramsey, but also not only just that, but also our response to it in the sense of what do we want to do with it? Like, where are we? Where do we see each other going from here? Embracing the dialectical nature of these discussions that we have been talking about since the very beginning. Trent, do you have anything to add to the summary?
No, I'm just eager to let the beans out because I've been trying to be really sympathetic and charitable in the previous two episodes, but that's
Yeah, me too. So there are a couple of things that we think are problematic in Ramsey, and some of these are more specific to Ramsey. Some others are probably a broader criticism of like maybe a lot of philosophers of biology as they approach the concept of human nature. Um, the more specific like Ramsey issues that we have identified starts with this whole idea about identity, right? Remember that one of the things that Ramsey kind of begins the book with is a naive realist of a sort of an approach to identifying human beings. He's like, yeah, you put human beings alongside other mammals, and we got it. We got it. We have humanity. We can identify it. Um, we don't have any problem with identifying humanity, so we shouldn't like this shouldn't be about identification. It should be about characterization. That's a very problematic assumption because then, yeah, if you're assuming the identity is clear, then you're assuming a whole bunch of other things. Um, like, is he thinking morphologically? Like, identifying in what sense? Because I can think about, like, I just remembered the movie Elephant Man by David Lynch, which is like this human being that doesn't look anything like human beings in morphological sense, uh, like babies born without any bones, like these kind of like elements that like if you put them alongside many, many, many other animals, um, could like make the identification sophisticated. But more importantly, this is just kind of like dodges something very important in, for instance, making the distinction between animal like animal kingdom and human beings, right? Because there are gonna be people who are gonna think that that distinction itself, that identification itself, is a very problematic one. There are others who would say that there are these very strict criteria for speciation and distinction between a species that is going to make sense. And judging that question seems very, very shady. And add to this problem the problem of, our creations, different forms of AI that might have a lot of features that we have. Like identifying it, in what sense? Like, are we identifying them based on how they externally look? That sounds very, very rough, um, kind of a sketch. Because of course, like outwardly, we can create a robot that looks like a human being. We're talking about internal organisms, but then the whole story becomes like the whole story of what identifies humanity becomes a problem. Because you want to say that, okay, everyone who has a heart as a human being, right? It has this specific type of a heart as a human being. Like if someone like is born with a very weird type of a heart that is not common at all, like what do we do with that? If there's a chromosome discrepancy, like what are we going to do with that? And I think like in our conversations with Trent, one of the things that we have like come across is like a very clear problem with this. This is probably the most straightforward version of this, as we compared to all the stuff that I mentioned now, is that like historically there've been a lot of times in human history that a group of quote unquote human beings has been called as not a human being, like just different forms of like extreme outcasting of a group of people as below human. Well, like, well, like if your identification was as naively like correct and incorrigible as Ramsey suggests, then what are these discrepancies? It seems like he doesn't understand that like his understanding of this identifier, how much of it is just something that he just has assumed. Um, and he just helps himself by not even discussing any sort of an identifier in the process. Trent?
Yes, I think I agree with you. I think Grant Ramsey's sort of key problem here is the identifier, the agent of identification is not involved. It seems like identity is something outside communication, and it's intrinsic to that species or to that individual. So no matter whichever individual you ask to identify a fellow human being, they'll give you the same answer. And in that sense, that he is assuming that his specific human non-human boundary that is informed by his disciplinary training, like perhaps looking at the chromosome, whatever, or his cultural position that is in 20th, 21st century Anglophone – scholar, does not come to the fact that what does it mean to be human? So he already answered the question of the human nature, and he already knows the answer for what does it mean to human. Or his theory is just providing a description, a characterization to help to provide clarity of that general intuition one is like born with. So I think that's in that sense we are um not satisfied with the account providing. Like the identification seems not a dialogue, not the interaction between the subject and object, but also but simply as a very transparent kind of essence. One can also, even though he doesn't want to use the term, that belongs to the object alone. Yes, which is immune to like social perception or like phenomenology. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to put it. I think that yeah, he doesn't understand that he's holding a position. He thinks this transcends his particular position as an agent of identity. Like he is identifying, and that process of identifying is not just something that is the naive realist framework is not gonna work out. What about the evolutionary uh, assumption? Like we keep mentioning evolutionary biology, but we seem to have a problem with that part of it.
Yeah. Thanks for putting it on the slide. It's really important, central. My dissatisfaction with Ramsey to a large extent comes from his inconsistent use of the term of evolution. It seems to me evolution concerns time. I mean, the evolutionary can, but he dismisses, equates the evolution with nature. That's not the meaning of evolutionary we're talking about here. Um, it seems to me his model, cluster model, has a space for time, but the time but causality itself has nothing to do with time. Time exists only as a measurement. So it's like a framework. It's the horizon. We use time to settle, oh, for practical use. If we care about the policy in the coming 20 years, then the time frame should be these 20 years and no more. If we care about like enhancement of certain behavioral trait among a specific human community in the coming 2 years, then we're using 2 years. But the fact that something happened in the past or at this moment also influence how certain traits are interconnected and causally sustained in the next moment, that possibility is not at all considered, which would which I think is reviewed most clearly in his unjustified dismissal of Dubray's processional approach. Because why? It's just like we're not doing that, but there's no reason given. I think the key reason is that his model has very unsophisticated and perhaps internally conflicting relationship with the time. The causality is out of time, but the traits that are causally sustained are inside time. So time plays like a very ambivalent and troubling role in this model. That's my interpretation. Yes.
Yeah, and I think to add a couple points to what you said, um, what is kind of strange about this to me is that what has evolutionary biology done for Ramsey? Because like I can think someone a pre-Darwinian person showing up and say, "Hey, you want to know human nature? Let's take this a snapshot of humanity at this point, right? Let's see what things are kind of, restricting one another, what things are constraints on one another, and yeah, like if a biologist, that's just as an example, like this is not very plausible, but imagine like a biologist that doesn't believe in evolution by natural selection. Like imagine that knows about like some knowledge of genes, but doesn't believe this is about like evolution. Right? I'm just making this up to make a point. I think that person can hold Ramsey's approach to human nature. That you can go ahead,
Yes.
find the causal links as existing. That's it. And then the only thing is that for that person, they think they have found something maybe bigger, more universal.
Mhm.
Sure, that's true. They don't think this account is susceptible to change, but the way they go about finding the connections is the same. And I think that's what I want to emphasize. Of course, this alternative approach is less influenced by evolutionary biology by thinking that by analyzing here and now, everything has been analyzed, right? And Ramsey definitely doesn't think that. But in terms of like finding the causal links and clusters and relationship between traits, they seem to me to be exactly the same. They're mirroring one another. And I wonder if that's not a problem. I wonder whether this is not a suspicious thing that in understanding the relationship between everything, suddenly everything is frozen. And I think that's what makes Dupre's account interesting to us because we think an account that tries to find human nature within this unfolding process of life without this kind of very snapshotty kind of a view of nature might give us a very um, a more coherent viewpoint. I think somewhere Ramsey mentions that processes could not have natures, and I don't understand why that must be the case. Like I think uh, when we think about like processes that exist within the evolutionary ground, we can think about like humanity as like a pattern that appears and disappears within those processes. And going back to that kind of level of analysis may kind of make may turn fluctuation of the primary point and kind of give time justice in the analysis. And that's something that we need to talk more about when we read Dupre and see if evolution gets activated at any other level than the level of, hey, this account is susceptible to change, right? Which I think it doesn't seem to be reusing all the resources available to an evolutionary, quote unquote, evolutionary. Now, there is something that you want to say, Trent, to that, and then we can go to the more broader issues. Yes, Trent.
Yeah, yes. I just want to say the point the thought experiment you proposed is an excellent, and I really wonder how Darwin would react to this because like I read Darwin. I'm not an expert on him, but I read his like Origin of Species when I was a kid, and it seems to me that Darwin had a way more nuanced understanding of time. That speciation for Darwin is on one hand the contemporary here and now classification and identification of species, but also the tracing the evolutionary trajectory, the tree of life, time matters in a way that way more central than in Ramsey's model. So that's why whenever Ramsey uses the word speciation, I become kind of like unclear. Are we talking about the evolution or speciation as a process, or as a ongoing process, like human beings are still evolving, or are we just talking about the contemporary classification? In that sense, you're absolutely right. Pre-Darwinian natural scientists, natural philosophers would catalog like plants, providing binomial naming system to help identification, but they don't necessarily, and they will maintain their like causal relationships between their like environment and certain features they have. So behavioral as well as like or the other one. Morphological traits, so they're constantly mutually sustaining, but they don't consider this as a part of an going, changing, malleable process. And the current correlation owes much to the historical accumulation of mutual triad errors, which is precisely what Darwin proposed. So yes, just to say that point is great.
I think that's a great point, and I think the way that now that makes sense more for me in terms of like an analogy is that like someone showing up and saying that, hey, I want to analyze the political situation of today, here
Mm,
and now, and yeah, sure, you can do that, but it seems like that analysis, like whatever is the political situation of now,
mm,
the history of the political situations has something to do with it. Like, and going back to this kind of like locating Ramsey in the traditions, his move, like I think mirrors like analytical philosophy. That forget about like what we what consciousness.
right.
We've talked about consciousness, history of the discussion, whatever. We're just gonna analyze consciousness, and we're just gonna like treat it as just came to us. Consciousness. Let's just analyze it, right? And I'm not passing the judgment about accuracy of this in general. Maybe for some analyses that make sense, but I think it is suspect for something that is related to evolutionary biology to kind of have a very kind of absent-minded view of the past in its analysis and be just this kind of very isolated here and now. Um, are we ready to go to the next round? Yeah. So I think the next kind of package that we have for you is probably a little bit more general than just the problem with Ramsey. And I think all of them are relevant for us, and all of them we need to like deal with in a more depth. And the first one is this concept of trait. Trent, could you tell us what kind of problems we face with this?
Yes, my heart almost stopped when I was like reading this. I think there are three things worth pondering. I had a certain initial reaction, but those I still feel grateful for the production of the book, okay, because it provides the material for me to kind of articulate what I want, a method that incorporates both behavioral or like cultural and natural or the morphological traits of human nature should look like. I think the first thing to notice is traits are, you can disagree with this. I'm just thinking now. Traits are essences deconstructed. That he says, Grant Ramsey says, like human beings do not have essence because it changes, but traits do not change. And traits carry very stable, if not fixed, meaning or that name, if you say like having wings, can fly. That means that 1,000 years ago. That means precisely that here and now. That meaning doesn't change. So what we are getting, the model of human nature we get is not a solid monolith, but it's a cluster of small pebbles. And this disagreement between Bing theory and like a cluster theory is essentially how do you recognize the patterns among such pebbles? Like a certain beings that is the pebbles inside, like does the being belong to human? If the trash can is a human being, therefore, like those are traits to human nature. But Clarkson is saying there are like an interrelation, law of interrelation, regulating the patterning or the grouping of such clusters, and that's what set human apart from other social animals. And that if this analogy we can start from, you can disagree. If if trait is essentially deconstructed and instance at a minor a scale, then many more questions could be asked. First, so why just stop there? Why don't we keep deconstructing? And the second is if speciation doesn't is easy, that we can easily identify human beings, individuals in our time. Why can we easily and without an ambiguity or disagreement identify like trait? Me, given all the life story I have, would see a trait as being honest, and you probably recognize it as dishonest or like misleading. So if we are talking about behavioral trait, to what extent observers personal package or like framework of thinking matter in the recognition or identification of traits. And one final thought, we can come back to that, is this really parallels. This is just an interesting thought. One dominant camp of cultural anthropology, it's called phenomenology. The most famous thinker in that camp is called Clifford Geertz, who uses precisely this trait approach to interpret and describe cultures. For him, he's just like Ramsey. He's very much against essentializing cultures. You cannot say there's like a Javanese culture, American culture. Instead, you can say there are cultural texts, he says, which are just like traits here. They're symbols with fixed or stable meanings, the meaning of which are known to the insiders, but not to outsiders. So that cultural anthropology should like learn their worldview and learn to interpret such things. So culture cannot be essentialized, but cultural behaviors could be, and that's the basis sort of for like cross-cultural communication. And I think certain similar ideas is here. Traits could transcend potentially cultural natural border, species borders, but they are the universal currency for Grant Ramsey's like method of interpretation. So those are, I think, are first of all assumptions not really justified. Second, there can be if we really dig into it, incoherency or inconsistency. Why do we stop there? Why are certain traits recognized as traits or certain traits not? And why don't we further deconstruct or contest? So those are my thoughts on this naturalness or givenness of traits as a basic unit of analysis. Yes.
Yes, and I think I definitely agree with you that the way Ramsey deals with it, and seems like a lot of people deal with it, there is something given about it that is is bothering me. Like I agree with you that there is something there that I am not happy with either. Also, I understand this kind of like one consequence of that, or one reason that that happens, is that there is no understanding of the kind of a symbolic apparatus within which like distinguishing traits matter. Like it's just again like a person who thinks of traits from a naive realist perspective would think that traits are traits just out there, you point at them, just like human beings are just there and you point at them. And in that way it just kind of begs the question of of how things uh, of whether this is the right way to approach this matter. I think the only part of this that is not anything against what you said, but I'm not sure what alternative exists other than traits. Like alternatives that are not just alternatives in name, right? But
Mm.
alternatives that are, kind of take us to a different kind of logic. Because I don't think a minimal change to the concept of trait could solve the problem. I can definitely see that by like kind of self-locating the language of traits, in the sense that we kind of culturally situate what is understood as trait and what is not, we can have a more critical stance on, how we use the concept. We can also add it that, something that looks like a trait now could be a completely different thing. He's in a historically different space, in a culturally different space. But I'm not sure if there is, like, if I know of any alternative. And just as a thought, not that something that I expect you to expound now, but do you have a competing concept to traits as a unit of analysis that you can maybe talk about a little bit?
First disclaimer, I share your position. I know there's like a theoretical problem with Gert's cultural text interpretation, yet I use it all the time in my research. And precisely because it's so hard to think of a valid alternative. And I'm not speaking about the evolution of biology here. I'm talking about cultural anthropology. There have been proposals of alternatives. Um, that will take a long time to explain. I'll just give one example. Levi-Strauss, that the French anthropologist, structuralism is trying to kind of replace symbols that are like traits with fixed or stable meaning attached to it with the concept of signs, namely, kind of foregrounding the ambiguity of interpretation of symbols. So he would say individuals or different cultures will interpret the same traits very differently. However, there is a logic to the way they associate meaning with trait. So but you can say this is kind of dualist solution that we have a realm of meaning and a realm of like symbols or traits. Then the law of association is beyond either domain. So we have this type of alternative, and if you use that, it will lead to a very different interpretation of certain social habits. Why do certain groups have certain taboos? Gertian approach will say because these symbols have this specific meanings, they are avoiding it because they cannot bring different contradicting meanings together in one action. But Levi-Strauss would say, no, 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 no. That has nothing to do with meaning. This is really about how like human mind works in associating in constructing in groups versus out groups, constructing like male versus female. That's kind of binary thinking works in a certain free associative way. So it's meaningful alternative for cultural anthropology or cultural interpretation. I'm not sure whether we have like really powerful and palpable alternative to trait in the Ramsey sense for evolutionary biology or philosophy of life or biology. But I'm curious whether
Mhm.
Dubray's process is providing an alternative. Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's as like just to leave it as a question. I think our question is like, is a non-trait based account of human nature possible? Like, is like something that is not just substituted with like feature and just like do the same thing, but like a
Right.
very different kind of a model of understanding human nature, whether that's possible or not.
Very quick kind of a follow-up as you were responding to my. I think we might benefit from reading early scholastic Buddhist philosophy because they are exactly dealing with the trade problem. The term they call trade is called dharma, which is this is really like a Graham Ramsey. It's also the universal human nature. The whole universe is bound by dharma, but the most basic constituent part that is bound that follows the law of dharma is called dharma with a small d instead of a capital D, and there are like 18 schools in the earliest, so to speak, to kind of make sense of relationship between identity, causality, among identity, causality, and the Dharma, and whether it exists or not. So we might benefit in thinking with them and trying to come up with non-trait based way to describe causality, because they did. Certain schools are called there's no such thing as Dharma school, literally. So
Yeah.
yes,
No,
that's
that's very interesting. Yeah, and I think it's something that the problem I think that we're facing here is a far more basic problem and definitely requires some sort of a retreat to a more basic understanding of very basic symbols. So it's not just an evolutionary biology problem. It's not just a Ramsey problem. It's a bigger problem. To get to the last 2 points, um, and all of these points are just going to be with us in our discussions. The other problem that we recognize here is this natural culture, nature culture distinction, an assumption that that itself is a natural distinction. By that I mean that we have the naive realism about identification, we have the naive realism about traits, and I think we have the naive realism about the distinction between nature and culture. I want to be charitable to Ramsey and give him the praise that I think there are some like themes in his account that is very clear in how he doesn't think this distinction is a very kind of a rigid one. Um, but like what I am concerned about is that I think there is some sort of a contradiction in Rams's position. And I think that contradiction exists in very different ways in other thinkers, but I think in the case of Ramsey is interesting because you have those thinkers that Ramsey goes against that I want to say that, hey, natural means evolutionary, evolutionary means not historical, and the rest. We already talked about what's going to be a problem with that. And Ramsey is with us, right? That is a troublesome distinction. But then he thinks about the concept of human nature as something only a matter of scientific viewpoint. And I'm assuming natural scientific viewpoint. He goes ahead and kind of like dismisses all the meaning making processes and myths and theories that we have about human nature that comes from our narratives, right? And I'm not sure why, because number one, if the distinction between nature and culture uh, is, as I think rightfully Ramsey mentions, very problematic in the sense that we might say that our nature, our natural aspect is itself cultured. Like it's not like the distinction, they're infused somehow, and that isolation creates a very distorted image of what we are. Then why are we thinking about the question of human nature as a merely natural scientific question? Like, in what sense that is, because like that's how he opens the book, right? That we're not concerned about theories of human nature. We're not interested in cultural anthropology. What we're interested in is the scientific, how human nature is kind of like as an object of um, natural science. But according to Ramsey's account, cultural analysis cannot be separated from evolutionary analysis. So, as much as human nature is a concept of natural science, this is a concept of all the other humanities. And I don't see any sign from Ramsey pursuing that path. He's not like that, hey, now let's go and read history. That doesn't seem to be the message of the book. Uh, because especially he mentions this kind of like our meaning making is not something that is relevant. Well, first of all, it is relevant because if you Like I think that's going back to Marx. That's I think something that Marx recognizes that's very interesting, which is like every kind of economic structure pretends there is a human nature, turn that into some form of propaganda, and unconsciously or not unconsciously, that's not important for our case. Um, and then people will start to look that way, actually, right? If you go around and just teach like 3-year olds that you are a sinner, then the traits and the cluster of the traits in that group of people will change. So that is storytelling that we have is not something independent because that's a cultural act. And we've already established that the cultural act is an indispensable part of any sort of natural condition that we have. So dismissal of the cultural element on the side of dismissing the myth making as an example of that process, to me, is in clear contradiction with Ramsey's acknowledgement of the role of culture as it pertains to finding the causal links. Um, this, of course, is about a bigger debate about nature and culture, but I think the inconsistency in Ramsey's account is something important to like ponder upon, because if if the door of the culture is unleashed through an evolutionary account, then I think that we might be entering an interesting territory. That starting from purely evolutionary, we just found culture there, and now something must change about that original conception. For me, though, Ramsey thinks about his assertion that human nature is an object of natural science, or that's the part that matters, is an axiom that is not susceptible to dialectical change. And I find that problematic.
Yes, I agree with you. There is something fundamentally dogmatic about that. But I think I want to go back to a conversation we started in the last episode about the Supreme Court, a relationship here, because it seems to me that his relationship with the disciplinarity is really interesting. On one hand, he accepts the legitimacy of multiple disciplines and he respects the kind of the sovereignty of each discipline. So he starts his like book or pamphlet with the disclaimer. This book is not about cultural anthropology. This book is not about theories of human nature. This book is about what human nature really is. And his model, his cluster theory could translate or systematically reduce or filter cultural behavior or phenomena into his traits. But I wonder whether he would say the opposite could be done meaningfully, that the causally sustained relationship between two humans, say, hormone level or internal organisms could be turned into meaningful object study for cultural anthropology. He probably say, no, that's nonsense. If like cultural anthropology started to talk about why these two organs were involving, that's just no, it's irrelevant. It's out of their domain. But so there's some asymmetry, I think, or at least I that's an impression I got. Like natural scientific method that he masters allows him to talk about culture, but not necessarily the other way around, which is also an dogmatic assumption, and I don't think that could be like uh, modified given however much cultural anthropologists have done or philosophers, historical philosophers done to expose Oh, your position is actually not a scientific natural position, but also a cultural position that is a direct heir of like a Kant Hegel so Enlightenment model. Yet you don't consider what you assert as nature at actually has also a cultural package to it. Yes, that's
Yes, and I think this is actually a very good space, like very good kind of like entry point to the last point that we have here. Because I think like there are many issues with like inference, right? This is not an easy issue, but I think there are some issues that exist with like Ramsey that really kind of goes back to his understanding of, causal links between traits. And this becomes particularly a problem when we kind of understand that he wants to have elements of culture and elements of nature kind of intertwined, interwoven in the same kind of a plane, right? They are like happening at the same level. It seems like. Um, I think it's interesting to think about causality and whether the conception of causality that we have for, when we're doing like, uh, theoretical physics, right? Something that doesn't have any concept of life, right? We are working with certain concepts of causality. We're thinking about causality in certain ways. Causality becomes itself an object of, inquiry in the science of physics, so on and so forth. Um, Look, we have that, right? Let's just have that on one side. Then we have like, why Roman Empire
yeah.
collapsed, right? Like, okay, so we are looking for causes. Um, there are presumably methods for kind of like having a causal analysis of each of these. What is the relationship between the two? It seems like that for Ramsey, there is a collapse to a causal logic that doesn't matter what traits you give it to, it just finds their connections, and finds how they are kind of interacting with one another. And I wonder about that. I wonder about a very basic, language of inference that could be abstracted from all the possible inferences as the court of appeal of inferences, right? Because we had this problem, and I think it's a very serious, deep problem about inferences in Hegel, because Hegel is not a scientific reductionist, right? Hegel is not a natural scientific reductionist, but there is something reductionistic about Hegel, which is like there is a language of concepts that, independent from the domain, is applicable to everyone. And every difference between them could also emerge out of this kind of a basic conceptual distinction. So when we speak of being, we speak of pure being, we're speaking of pure being. That's just it. We're not talking about being of a thing, being of this thing, or that thing. When we talk about Dasein or determinate being, we're not talking about just chairs and atoms and human beings and like galaxies. We're just talking about determinate being. We're just at like a more abstract level. And then, step by step, we get to more familiar domains. And it's like, okay, here's nature. Here is Geist. Here is like, objects. Here is like, whatever, like subjective condition, whatever. Like all the other concepts come out of this kind of basic, like, ground level, um, concept creating machine, right? I just wonder if there is something problematic there or not. Uh, at the least, we can say that someone like Ramsey does not seem to be very curious about the possible differences in understanding causality in different planes. For him, like perhaps because all of this is happening in the same field of existence, all the ways that we can think about causality are going to be translatable and communicable within one language. I'm not even sure what that language for him is, because again, causality in organic chemistry is perhaps very different from causal analysis of comparative history. And where is that in this whole thing, right? Because we might be able to find that there is a causal language for human nature. I'm just making that up, but it's just like we can establish that here we think about causality. We can establish that we cannot establish a language, right? We can do a lot of things, but Ramsey doesn't seem to be interested in any of them, right? And I think what makes the case more complicated and kind of, in some ways, hopeless is the point about this kind of intertwined aspect of nature and culture when it comes to biological entities, especially human beings, and having culture in the you know culture of the capital T, capital C, sorry, um, um, because even if we say that okay, there is a very different kind of causal story when we're talking about biological traits as opposed to cultural traits, right? Um, then if we have already established that these are very much intertwined, what does that tell us about causality? Um, and again, this is not so much a criticism of Ramsey for me. It's about a bigger puzzle that we have here about language of causality, because it feels very like it doesn't sound right to me to say that a way a therapist finds causes of someone's neurotic behavior um, is the same kind of a process that a physicist like finds the distance of a galaxy. Like they don't seem to be doing the exact same thing. And I wonder that abstraction, trying to kind of find a common ground between causal planes. I wonder if that doesn't just simply land us in a wasteland of an abstraction that really doesn't tell us anything. Trent?
Yes, I totally agree with you on that. As he Graham Ramsey uses the term causality without specifying whether it's sensitive to time, whether it's a singular or plural, whether it's a context sensitive. It's just like a black box for him to lump everything into it. And as you rightly point out, the inferential the multiplicity is reduced into one collective term, and of course there are possible ways of finding such universal causality, but does that provide any clarity or any explanation for anything we care about is a different question. Yes, and I agree with you. Many of the points we have raised in this episode are kind of prompted by Ramsey's really confident and self-assured usage, but it is definitely not unique to him, but rather a way more general practice, one would say. Yes. So on that note, I'll just correct one thing. I'm medievalist, and Roman Empire never fell. It lives in my heart. So on that cheering note, we'll conclude our discussion. And you want to talk about what we're gonna do next, or?
Yeah, so I think with this again our next move is gonna be a reaction to what we experienced here, and I think what there are two pathways that we're very interested in, and I think both of them is we're gonna just do it one by one. Is one is like other evolutionary accounts of human nature. They're not trait bin accounts, but they're not Ramsey's account either. Like Dupre's process-oriented metaphysics. That's one path that we're interested in. That's when immediately we're gonna venture to data space. And also the point about, this culture nature dynamic. Like thinking about and thinking with cultural anthropologists and you know uh, other like humanities focused individuals that understand this idea of self relation, like take that more seriously. They don't necessarily think about a study of human nature as something that is we're studying an external object, but they really take seriously this phenomenological aspect of humanity in terms of like myth creating, meaning creating, assuming our human nature is so and so, and how that really is an essential part of what we are. That process is not just reducible to an abstract understanding of creativity of imagination, but it's about something that directly contributes to human nature itself, not just human nature's conceptions of human nature.
Yes, indeed.
With that, I think we can wrap this up.
Yes, so dear listeners, thanks for following our animated debates or discussion, and stay tuned. More is coming up.